Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us. Ruben, are you joining us from abroad? Are you allowed to even tell us your locations?
I'm allowed. I just came back from work travel, so I went to Kenya for a meeting with officials of South Sudan,
Oh, right, right,
government from the Ministry of Justice of South Sudan, where there are ongoing efforts to implement a peace agreement. But I'm back, so I'm in
right.
New Jersey, New York area.
So, Attorney Carranza, this is related to your work with your center, right? Transitional
Right.
justice, yes, exactly. Just want to make sure. Malay ko baka since our last talk, you have been hired in a new position in the UN or something like that. You're not too far from New York, right?
Right. Yeah, right. I think since the last time we spoke, I
Right.
did go to Sudan, which is
You mean
what South Sudan
North
used to be part
Khartoum
of.
or South Sudan? Oh, yeah, South Sudan.
Yes, Khartoum. I went to Khartoum, and I was there for a few days. But after I left, war broke out about a
Right.
month later, and so that's how difficult it is to do the job I do sometimes, where no matter what you do, try to move justice and peace agendas forward, there will always be the possibility that it won't happen or that things will even get worse.
Yeah, and then of course the neighboring Ethiopia situation is also quite crazy, right? I mean, you had no less than a Nobel Peace
Mhm.
Prize laureate overseeing, some would say, not only mass atrocity, but one of the worst mass atrocities in recent times, right?
Right,
Do you have an
right.
update on the Ethiopia situation? I mean, it was really insane last year, and it was just buried because of the
Mhm.
Ukraine war. And I hate to say it, but I just felt both crises deserve their. I mean, we're dealing with all human beings, right? I mean, I love Ukraine, but
Exactly,
Ethiopia, they're also human beings, right? Yeah.
exactly, and on your last point, that's very important because Ethiopia, like you said, uh, went through a war that some would even call genocide.
Exactly.
But at the same time, it was also a preventable war. It wasn't something
Right.
that wasn't building up over time. It was building up over time, and I think so that sometimes external actors ignore these signs and giving the president of Ethiopia a Nobel Peace Prize for finally going into a peace agreement with another neighbor
Right.
doesn't mean that you're not enabling him to, on the other hand, oppress his own people within the country. But as of now, we do have a program in Ethiopia. And as of now, I think things have subsided to the extent that
Mm-hmm.
there are efforts to not just go for a ceasefire, but actually begin to withdraw from the battlefield. And that doesn't mean, however, that that's the end of the grievances that were precisely
Right.
led to war. And that doesn't mean that it also ends efforts to hold those who committed the worst atrocities in this latest escalation to account. So that's always the other side of peace. That there must be justice after peace begins, and you have to be careful about pursuing justice in a fragile situation because you also don't want to upset the peace that you have extracted from warring parties.
Yeah, I mean the situation in Ethiopia is quite crazy, right? I mean, my fear is this is just a deadlock. We had accusations of other countries from the Middle East getting involved with their drones, sales of drones. Same thing now we're seeing also in Khartoum. So it's no longer just the West or China interfering in African conflicts. You have Middle Eastern powers also interfering there. The
Mhm.
Emiratis have their own boys there, running the show from Libya to Ethiopia. So there are people who talk about multipolar world and they're so excited of the decline of the West, and I always say, well, there's hegemony and it's tyranny, and then there's chaos and multipolarity, right?
Right.
And when I look at Africa and a lot of regions of the world, I'm very worried about the post-American world. I'm no fan of American hegemony, but what's coming out of it is really, really troubling. So but how do you keep your sanity? I mean, it must be a very frustrating job, right? You go there, look at transitional justice, look at an element of sanity and humanity, and then boom, the next thing you know, there's another war breaking out in a neighboring country or some province of the same country you're
Mhm.
dealing with.
Well, I think what's important, and I also give this advice to other human rights activists
Right.
that I work with. It's important to look at small victories, to celebrate small victories. I think that's what can power you forward. That's what can give you momentum. And if it doesn't give you momentum, at least it gives you time to breathe, time to consider what you've already accomplished, time to decide how far you can still go. We should not belittle these
Right.
small victories that we get out of our work, because they constitute what might become bigger victories in the future.
Right. Speaking of small victories, balikan natin yung issue ng ICC, right? We keep on hearing that ICC is a colonial institution. This is supposedly a legal analysis by some officials in you know where. Some are saying it's a white man's court. Well, in fact, if you look at it, not very white man. In fact, there are even colored women there, including the former chief prosecutor. So obviously, some are not doing even their basic Wikipedia. But some are also saying, ano, wala namang ambag tong ICC na to eh, pinagtatawanan lang yan. And yet, we just got an update. Speaking of Africa, of course, South Africa is hosting this year's BRICS Summit events. Brazil, Russia, India, China. This year is particularly big, of course, Ruben, because they're going to discuss, BRICS currency. They're going to talk about the new world order. Obviously, the Ukraine issue is there. They're going to talk about potential admission of new powers. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Argentina are in the mix. So this is probably going to be a kind of a landmark year for BRICS. And yet, someone could not, is not very welcome in South Africa. And his name is no less than Vladimir Putin, right? So upon mutual consent, now Putin could not make it or will not make it to the BRICS summit in the coming week or so. And there are also discussions on perhaps him also skipping the G20 summit in India, a country that is even closer to Russia strategically, later this year. What was your take on that? Did you see this coming? Do you think this is relevant in any way? What does it say?
Well, if not me, Vladimir Putin, more importantly, should have seen this coming. It's important to remember the context. This is South Africa. This is a country where there was an earlier attempt a few years ago to withdraw
So
from the
DUTERTE,
ICC.
exactly. Mm-hmm.
And activists in South Africa, from the left as well as from the right, in fact, actually took the same effort to challenge the withdrawal from the ICC. They went to court and they won.
Right. The High Court of
government
South Africa. The High Court of South
Yes,
Africa. Yes, in
the
Supreme
high
Court.
the High Court of South Africa.
Yeah.
They won a demand that South Africa withdraw the withdrawal. In other words, not withdraw from the ICC, and so South Africa remains a state party to the ICC. But what that tells you is that some of these legal issues, the authority of the ICC, the enforcement of its orders, including its warrants of arrest, the idea that the ICC can only work if states actually took it seriously and that states treat each other equally as
Right.
ICC member
Right.
states.
Right.
These ideas are taken seriously in a country that knows what inequality is like, in a country where activists realize that if you don't take these questions of enforcing and respecting what your constitution says, what your
Right.
treaties require you to do, things will go back to the kind of situation they had under apartheid. So what happened here was that Russia and its diplomats, I think they did realize that it was going to be a problem for Vladimir Putin to go to South Africa, even without the ICC case, as a matter of fact. I think even without the
Right.
ICC case, he would have faced challenges. Technically, South Africa has domesticated the ICC treaty, meaning there are laws in South Africa you can use to actually call for the prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity
Right.
committed by other people. So that could have happened. In any case, I think this was a diplomatic way out, and I think it's fair to say the South African government, I think, realized it's been trying to follow the middle line here. They have not outright condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On the other hand, they have also tried to facilitate some ways in which there can be, if not peace, at least a ceasefire in Ukraine. So to be
Right.
fair to the South African government, they haven't taken one side or the other in ways that close the door to peace.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned the South Africa case is because it's a very familiar case, right? It may seem like a country so far away, but you had exactly this precedence whereby there was also an attempt by the previous, a more controversial administration to take the country out of ICC. And then, of course, you have a country that is now technically neutral on the conflict. That sounds very Marcos Jr., if not, of course, Duterte. So both Duterte and Marcos administration have taken that. And of course, just the other month, you had the African delegation led by the South African leader who visited both Ukraine and Russia to kind of help facilitate the situation there. So, and not to mention, earlier this year, and this is what's absent with the Philippines, perhaps that's what Duterte wanted. In fact, there were joint naval drills between South Africa and the Russians and all to the south of the equator, right? So, given how close the two countries have been economically, strategically, and also personal relations between leaders, what's fascinating is that, as you also correctly argue, it's not just the ICC, it's the embeddedness of ICC values in the very fabric of the legal and judicial institutions in South Africa that would have always raised concerns, right? For someone like from Putin. I wonder, is there a similar situation in the two other democratic members of BRICS? Let's say Brazil or India, if Putin were to go to India and Brazil also in the future?
Well, India is not a party to the ICC treaty, so there can be an argument that there is no obligation on the part of India to enforce any warrant of arrest, any orders from the ICC. On the other hand, you do have the same kind of social movements in India. Some of them more westernized in the sense that they'll simply argue that rule of law represented by the ICC requires India to respect the treaty nonetheless. And then you have more progressive social movements in India as well, who may not necessarily see the ICC as simply a objectively neutral court, but at the same time believe that getting its orders enforced in India can also help Indians fight for their own human rights. So that's a possibility. Brazil is hard to read. Lula is a progressive, but at the same time, Lula is also a populist, and you have a country that's divided between two populists, and therefore, necessarily, this is a country where the fight involves populist versus populist, and so you have to take into account what the popular sentiment is. Not the best way to govern, certainly, but at the same time, I think also required by his situation as a leader confronted by a fascist that still challenges his election.
Yeah, I appreciate the discussion of the issue of Lula because I think now in the Latin American case, you're having a big debate. You have no less than the Chilean president, who's I think my age, right? I think he's 35, 36. See, Boric, no, who has been coming out very strongly saying, Ukraine of today could be us tomorrow, right? And this idea that because we're against Western imperialism, we'll just turn a blind eye to what the others are doing, that's total nonsense. So we're seeing the new generation of leftist leaders, right, coming out and calling out this unfortunate, I call it Cold War leftism that Lula and many leftists in the Philippines tend to subscribe to, Kaya nga dito sa Philippines, I don't want to drop names, but we have situation where in my university, in UP, you have, wait lang, di ba itong mga katatay, ka-China, now suddenly they're hiding behind these progressives to question the Ukraine situation and all of that. So I'm very glad that young leaders like Boric are coming out. You also had people like Varoufakis, of course, in the case of Greece, also coming out and saying, look at what happened with the Prigozhin situation, that Putin was comparing that to Lenin taking over towards the second revolution within the revolution of 1917. So Putin hates the left. That's very clear, right? If you look at it. So I don't know. I just felt this war in Ukraine and all is also exposing a lot of ideological fault lines and debates, which is relevant to us in the Philippines. Because I think if you look at mainstream Filipinos, a lot of them feel that the left in the Philippines is not strong and progressive enough on the West Philippine Sea issue or anything that has to do with China or Russia, precisely because of this ideological blindfold. I mean, it's all good to hate the West for what they did 100 years ago or 50 years ago or what they did in Iraq, but let's not forget what's happening in our own backyard, for instance. Now, I don't want to go to the arbitration case issue. We can talk about that a lot, but obviously you see where this discussion is going, because within a window of 12 to 18 hours after the Putin announcement came out, the awkward announcement came out, you had the Secretary of Justice of the Philippines making essentially a public advice, no, to remnants of the previous administration, including one senator of this republic, right, Bato de la Rosa, and also the former President Duterte, who just had his Kissingerian moment in Beijing as a special guest and friend of China, advising them not to go to European countries or certain countries.
You know, Kissingerian can mean war criminal too, right?
Well, well, I had a conversation with Kissinger earlier this year. I'm looking forward to talk to him still. You know, I'm not a fan, but I want to keep the communication channels open. But going back to this, how do you feel? I mean, how do you feel about this? That, you know, you suddenly have the DOJ secretary coming out. Is it the job of the DOJ to warn the previous administration? Hi guys, ingat naman kayo dyan. Baka travel kayo, mag-shopping kayo sa London or something. What's going on there?
Well, what is funny but at the same time tragic about this is that government officials in the Philippines can't seem to distinguish the interests of the state and the interests of Duterte and his allies, who may or may not be prosecuted by the ICC, depending on the outcome of the prosecutor's investigation. They can't distinguish between the state's position with respect to the ICC. And to me, they are entitled to make arguments that they have been making in the ICC proceedings so far, challenging the application of complementarity, questioning whether the prosecutor's decision to investigate ignores the so-called investigations that they claim have been carried out in the Philippines. I think these are arguments that any state will make if it were interested in putting forward its view that it is willing and it is able to pursue accountability for the kinds of crimes, the international crimes that fall within the ICC treaty. But that's the state. That's the interest of the state. The Department of Justice Secretary, the Solicitor General, they are not lawyers of Rodrigo Duterte.
Exactly.
They are
like, what's going on?
lawyers of the state. On the other hand, giving advice to potential defendants to the ICC, I think, is an indication that they can't seem to also remove the political aspect of their role as Justice Secretary, as Solicitor General. And that's the other unfortunate side of this, because this is a situation where the interests of the Philippines has to be seen in a very long term, in a strategic way. If China, for example, were to, let's just say, join the ICC treaty, the ICC, the Philippines would have an interest in seeing whether there is a remedy in the ICC that might be available should Chinese officials, Chinese Navy soldiers.
There was an effort, earlier. Yeah, there was an effort to
exactly
target specific Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, for being behind the violation of Philippine sovereign rights and damage to ecology and livelihood.
Right, and that's the point of, and that's why it's important to distinguish between your role as a lawyer for the state, as a representative of the state, and someone who I don't know what the right Tagalog word for it is. Nakikisawsaw ka dun sa problema ng iba, no?
I mean, if Harry Roque said that, I would be okay with that, right? I mean, if Harry Roque were giving that public advice, I'm not sure I can follow Harry Roque anymore because I think SMNI is still banned on YouTube and all. But I look forward to watch them on CGTN. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
No. Here's a very important thing, Richard, that has been overlooked by, understandably overlooked by a lot of Filipino journalists, because it doesn't appear immediately, and it's not something you see on the surface of this ICC case involving the Philippines. The Philippine government, and I of course the journalists in the Philippines have covered this to that extent. The Philippine government hired a British law firm based in London.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask you about that actually. Yeah.
Bedford 9. row, which is BR9. That's what they call themselves. And lawyers in BR9 have represented different parties in different cases, including at the ICC.
Right.
One specific lawyer, his name is Stephen Kay,
Right.
is important to this discussion because while the lawyer uh, officially representing the Philippines at the ICC is Sara Bafadel, who is a lawyer within BR9. Her senior lawyer is really Stephen Kay. And Stephen Kay depends on whether you're Stephen Kay or not. Stephen Kay is notorious for representing ex-dictators, incumbent
It's
presidents
a niche.
accused of war
It's
crimes,
a
crimes
niche.
against
Yeah,
humanity, and
yeah,
there is absolutely nothing wrong with representing ex-dictators or war criminals who are accused of war crime, people accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity. That's the job of a lawyer. The problem is that some of the cases, some of the clients that BR9 and Stephen K represent have also been accused of intimidating or even killing
yeah.
witnesses and people that are involved in ICC cases. So Stephen K represented Uhuru Kenyatta, former president of
Kenya,
Kenya, when
yeah.
he was charged at the ICC. And so far, at least 13 persons have been killed or disappeared. Kenyans have been killed or disappeared connected to the case. And there is no explanation whatsoever on the part of Stephen Kay, whether he's aware of this and what his concerns are about this.
Oh,
There
wow.
is history between Karim Khan, the prosecutor, and Bedford
You didn't
Row
say that
9.
last time. You didn't say that last time when we discussed this.
Right. And so aside from that, and I told you earlier at the beginning of this conversation that I spoke with South
Interesting.
Sudanese officials,
Interesting.
Stephen Kay, in fact, provided legal advice to the president of South Sudan to shield him from prosecution for war crimes committed during in
Yeah.
2013, was paid about $17 million for a report. So I think it's important for Filipinos to ask how much is being paid
Yes, exactly.
Bedford Row 9 for its services, which brings us back to your question. They represent the Philippine government, the state. And so if you already have a lawyer representing the Philippines, why would you, as Justice Secretary, provide legal advice to people whose interests are not the same as the interests of the Philippines?
Yeah, I found it actually interesting when they hired this British barrister. They were all praised about her international credentials, etc. It's like wow, wow! Suddenly now you're a fan of European law legal community members and all of that, you know. But you're right. I appreciate that you given that kind of background about uh, conciliary type of lawyers. You know, they work for certain types of people. You know, again, we're not here to prejudge, but I think there's a track record there to look at. So were you troubled when there was the announcement on who they chose to represent the Philippines? I mean, why would they even do that? Do you think because they recognize their arguments are so weak and that they're not taken seriously?
Let me give one theory, and it will seem unfair, but maybe not. You know, the Marcoses are used to hiring lawyers who influence courts and not in always in an ethical way. That's why the Marcoses have always relied on the dictatorship's former Solicitor General, Estelito Mendoza, who has been very instrumental in the appointment of many judges and justices in the Philippines, including many of those who are now in the Supreme Court. And that to me not just straddles the line between ethical and unethical, but already often crosses it, into the unethical side. So the Marcoses are used to hiring people who can do extra legal work, some of that extra legal work being outside the pale of simply lawyering. And then of all the possible defense, or not defense, of all the possible lawyers that the Philippines could have hired to represent Philippines' position at the ICC, the fact that they chose BR9 says a lot. Their research would
Mm,
have gone into that selection. I'm sure they're aware of
right.
the background of Stephen Kay. I'm sure they know the relationship between Stephen Kay and Karim Khan. And so I'm sure this was a deliberate choice, it certainly wasn't the lowest bid that prompted the Philippines to hire BR9 in this case.
Yeah, maybe it's my lack of scrolling through the local news coverage, but parang that went off the radar. No, I didn't see any when news was announced, it was just announced like just some world class whatever. So parang at the back of my mind is this like another Amal
The problem,
Clooney?
Richard, is
Yeah, what
yeah, the
happened there?
problem is that we are often Filipinos, and including myself. I mean, knowing the mentality, we're often dazzled by the mere appearance of someone who isn't local, and just assume that a Western person,
Global siya,
represents some kind of a rule of law ideal.
yeah.
Does not represent a political agenda, which is both foolish and misplaced. Because obviously, these are people who are paid. These are mercenaries without weapons.
Exactly. I mean,
And
we have
so,
reputational management industry. I mean, London is at the very cutting edge of this. If I'm not mistaken, former Prime Minister Tony Blair, right, has had meetings, perhaps more than one, with President Junior and others. And we know
exactly.
what Tony Blair does, right? One day is in Kazakhstan, one day
Mhm,
is in Dubai. Practically all the well-funded, well-endowed, non-democratic
mhm.
systems. So there is an industry out there, and a lot of that is in London,
Right.
right? If I'm not mistaken. So I just wonder bakit no one did discuss this part, diba? Kasi with Amal Clooney naman, is because she's a celebrity, right? And of course the case of Amal Clooney is for again for as an outsider, I was like, what, Arroyo's lawyer and then Maria Resa's lawyer is like, what's going on here, right? Obviously, the standard answer is we're lawyers, we're here to help, right? Like there's no, but you get what I'm saying. Like as someone who's quite aware of the whole industries out there, sometimes I'm looking at these aspects. So thank you very much, Attorney Carranza, for also mentioning that because this was kind of overlooked, I think, in local discussions. Now, going back to this, do you think that indeed should Bato de la Rosa or Duterte or some of the former top generals in the police force be worried about visiting London or visiting Paris or visiting Madrid? I mean, I see a lot of endowed Filipinos. I mean, go to Spain nowadays in Madrid, no, ang daming Pinoy nag-invest, ang daming gusto mag golden visa, right? Or at least like, what's
Mhm.
happening there? What would you be your advice were you their lawyer? Which will never be, of
Well,
course.
I think Rodrigo Duterte already showed us what his travel plans are by traveling already to China. I think
Yeah,
it's
it's,
an
it's just
indication
across
that,
China, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Xiamen, ganun lang.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
China is a huge country,
yeah.
and he's only visited Hong Kong and Beijing, so there's
There's a
maybe
lot.
a billion more people to meet. And it also tells us that he's not above what he thinks is flexing geopolitical muscle. Uh, you know, putting up a sign that says China is on my side. Should you
Yeah.
try to charge me? Should you try to issue a warrant of arrest and have it enforced against me? It's also a signal not just to the ICC but to Marcos Jr. It's obvious that he is concerned that Marcos Jr. might be shifting his feet towards the United States. It's obvious that Duterte is aware that Marcos Jr. has his own family's ill-gotten wealth interests to look after, and that a large part of that money cannot be used in the United States because it will trigger, and this is one of the topics you wanted to talk about later, the Magnitsky Act, for example.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Rodrigo Duterte is sending a signal to Marcos Jr. that should you try to allow or use United States forces, for example, to enforce an ICC warrant in the Philippines, China will not be happy with that. And why would the United States try to enforce a warrant of arrest in the Philippines if it's not a member of the ICC? Well, because it might serve its interest, and it has done that elsewhere in the world, including in Africa, where U.S. forces, together with Rwandan forces, arrested a Congolese warlord in a third country. So the United States literally sees itself as a policeman of the world, even if it's not part of the police.
Yun nga, so Attorney Carranza, this is where the argument of our many friends comes in. But America, I mean, look at what they did to the ICC judges on the Afghanistan issue during the Trump administration, right? They were threatening ICC judges who were looking to accusations of human rights violations by American soldiers in Afghanistan. Look at the horrible things that America did in the Middle East. Look at hundreds of thousands of people who were affected by the war in Iraq, sometimes in the worst possible ways. So I usually hear this argument that etong ICC na to ay bias, ito ay walang ambag dahil walang ginagawa sa US. And then you have this weird situation, right? There's a global Magnitsky Act which kind of compels, right, countries to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction with respect to mass atrocities, etc. Can you give us a little bit of background on that? Kasi, again, because I wanted this. Okay, fine. Let's just go to the issue of jurisdiction, because there's another person we have to talk about. No, the former government Solicitor General, well, the former Justice Secretary, now the Solicitor General Guevara, right? What is the dynamic you see between Guevara and the current DOJ Secretary? Because sometimes I'm not sure they're exactly saying the same thing. Sometimes, like, wait, did they contradict each other? And then there's a Supreme Court case. Can you just break this down for people who are not very familiar? Like, before we even go to the Magnitsky Act, anong nangyari dito? And does it even make sense to have the former DOJ Secretary in your current administration? What does that say? Does it say something wrong? But then again, parang iba yung sinasabi ni Guevara minsan, iba yung sinasabi.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
From a largely formal technical level, the Solicitor General represents the state. Exactly. The Justice Secretary really is the prosecutorial arm of the government in its cases in the country. The Justice Secretary has nothing to do really with, for example, what the Philippines' position ought to be at the ICC. But the Solicitor General representing the state engages with the ICC. Now, of course, it's also possible. It's within the powers of the President of the Philippines to ask the Justice Secretary to do that instead. And when I was in the PCGG, for example, our request for mutual legal assistance directed at other states went through the Justice Secretary's office, not to the Solicitor General. So it's possible that you can mix the two. You can even have the same person be Solicitor General and Justice Secretary, which is what the Marcos dictatorship did with Islito Mendoza. So the technical aspects to this can be blurred, and you can have the same person and you can have the same policy. So obviously their disagreement is political, not legal.
Right.
And I think that says a lot about
what is the disagreement in particular?
Why there's...
Obviously, they're gonna deny there's a disagreement, but for us who read the statements and all, parang wait lang, hindi sila tumutugma. Can you explain, Attorney Carranza, for those who didn't catch this? So, what is the Guevara versus the Remulla positions that may give an impression of some inconsistencies?
Well, Boying Remulla, I'm not sure anymore whether we were in the College of Law at about the same time. He was ahead of me, but I was there as a freshman. But he's a politician, not more than a lawyer, and from a political family that owes a lot to the Marcoses. And at the same time, of course, wants to be its own dynasty and therefore outlast the Marcoses. So there's a lot going on there. Guevara, on the other hand, maybe at the beginning saw himself as a technocrat sitting in a legal position. But the problem with that is you cannot be a technocrat when your president is committing mass murder. So staying on as a technocrat while your president is committing mass murder makes you an enabler of mass murder. And so Leonardo Guevara is an enabler of the drug war killings carried out by Rodrigo Duterte. And maybe to that extent, he wants to defend it legally. He wants to stay at the ICC, try to argue a way out for Duterte, while the Justice Secretary wants to be the kind of populist that he thinks will amass more power for him and therefore attacks the ICC among a local audience, not really an international audience.
So it's more the public relations game, public diplomacy game, yeah.
Right, but here's the thing about it. On one hand, you have Remulla reiterating the same kind of unfounded arguments that the Philippines is no longer a party, did not cooperate with the ICC. And then you have the Solicitor General saying the same thing but at the same time contradicting himself by
Yun nga eh.
engaging with the
Yun nga eh. Medyo
ICC.
naipit ako dun sa parang tortured yung point eh. Oo.
Right, but I think this is also because and I've said this elsewhere, right? This is namamangka sa dalawang ilog. They feel there's nothing to lose saying one thing but doing another until it's of course too late, because what you say actually matters legally before a court. You
Right.
could be waiving jurisdiction, which is one of the arguments the Philippines could have raised at the outset, but it did not, which is why you have a decision, 3 votes in the majority saying this investigation can proceed, and you have 2 who essentially, the dissenting justices, judges of the ICC, saying that the Philippines withdrawal may have already ended the possibility of the ICC exercising jurisdiction. Now, the problem, of course, as even the dissenters would probably recognize, is that this was never raised by the Philippines. So you have 2 lawyers
Wait
who
lang, so
disagree. Apparently,
you're saying the dissenters were preempting an argument that was not raised to begin with?
the dissenters were deciding on an argument that was raised late by the Philippines.
So
It was
so
only
not a
raised on
total
appeal. They
phantom.
never.
Okay. I thought
Right,
it's a
because
phantom
you know
argument.
when you're led by a self-deluded client like Duterte, who claims he's the master of the law when it comes to prosecution, and yet does not understand what a treaty is. The problem there is that you're afraid as a Duterte surrogate to contradict him, and so they never raised this. All they did was let Duterte rant about the ICC being, like you said, a court of white judges. But when you look at the 5 people
institution, yeah.
who ruled on their appeal, one is from Peru, one is from Uganda. There's a French judge, there's a Georgian judge, and so this is a very diverse court where they themselves can't even agree which legal system to apply at the ICC. So,
Attorney Carranza, another question, because we also hear this argument that, but the appeal rejection decision did not address or resolve the jurisdiction issue. I mean, it's getting a little bit. I don't know how to nicely put it. You know what I'm saying, right? Can you explain that to us? In what sense did the appeal rejection settle the issue of the jurisdiction argument raised by the Philippine government?
well, lawyers will always tell you there are many kinds of concepts of jurisdiction before the court, but what is important here is the jurisdiction to apply the ICC treaty on the state, on the Philippines as a state. That's let's leave it at that first.
Right.
This idea of jurisdiction. The second important thing to remember, as every freshman law student will learn, is that objections to jurisdiction can be raised anytime. Right? And that's important.
Right.
The problem
Right.
is if you don't raise it at all. Or that if you raise it later, when it's too late because you've already said something else.
Right.
With all that said, there is nothing that stops. Remember, so far it's only been the Philippines as a state that has been arguing at the ICC.
Right.
So Bedford Row, the Solicitor General, the Justice Secretary, they all formally speak for the state. They don't formally speak for anyone else because we don't know who the accused might be, if there will be accused people in this case. So if at all, if ever, Rodrigo Duterte and others are charged with crimes against humanity at the ICC, they will have their turn to raise the question of jurisdiction. They will have their turn to say,
right. They can raise this again later.
It's not even again because they have never yet raised it as themselves. They have not appeared at the ICC. They have not been represented by
so you're saying
anyone
only
because
at the PR level, as a public speech act lang sila na question and jurisdiction, but from a legal standpoint,
Exactly.
they never procedurally argued that case. Okay.
because they have not been accused of anything. What has happened so far is that they presume themselves guilty instead of being innocent. Because
So,
why would you defend yourself when you
yeah.
have not
Parang
yet
wala
been
kami,
accused by anyone?
yung parang wala kami sinasabi, defensive na agad. Bakit? Bakit kayo nga, ganyan,
Exactly.
parang ganun nangyari. Wait lang, di pa kami nagsimula. I see what, yung parang nahuli ka sa traffic, yung hindi pa nagsalita yung MMDA officer, nagwawala ka na, di ba? Now,
Nagmamadali kasi
yeah,
ako.
exactly. I mean, I've seen a lot of that cases. Tapos biglang sabi ako, ma'am, di pa ako nagsalita. Ang dami niya sinabi. Sinira niya yung dangal ng aming opisina. Yung mga ganyan. I mean, my goodness. I mean, that just tells you about the culture of rule of law. Na wala pa tayo. I think people think that with intimidation and making noise and all, you can affect the course of action, which unfortunately sometimes happens. But going back to this, do you see the probability? I mean, obviously possibilities there, but the probability that some of the top officials from the former administration may indeed face a warrant of arrest, like what Putin is facing. Except they're not Putin and they're not from Russia, and some of them are not even in government anymore, and they're just private citizens being special guests of I don't know who you know who, right? Are you seeing that probability, not possible, probability, meaning more than 50% chance in the coming year or so? Let's say during Marcos Jr. era.
Yeah, and then that's a good way to qualify your question in the coming years or so.
Right.
Because, well, two things to remember. Um, Most ICC cases, except for a very few key exceptions, last so long before they even lead to a trial.
Right.
Sometimes they last long even at just the earliest stage, preliminary investigation, which is where
Yes.
the Philippines is at. In Colombia, preliminary investigation has lasted almost 10 years.
Right.
But that's because there were peace negotiations in Colombia, and
With
it just
FARC.
closed
Yeah.
just this year. The investigation was finally closed because there is a peace agreement. The exception is Libya, because there it just took a few weeks, but that was because the UN Security Council,
Right.
including with abstentions from China and Russia, allowed the ICC to proceed and issue warrants of arrest. So the rule is that it will take very long before anything happens. And of course, it is possible that warrants of arrest will be sought by the prosecutor once he concludes his investigation. And I feel that that will be the next step here. But the second thing to remember is that the ICC, by its own admission, is very under-resourced. The fact that the prosecutor has been able to carry out the Philippines investigation is, I think, credit, and I will say this bluntly, credit to the staff of the prosecutor's office, not to the prosecutor.
Ouch.
The prosecutor has made himself the star of a movie called the ICC in Ukraine, and has forgotten that the ICC was not designed just for this war in Ukraine, but for many other wars that are also simultaneously taking place in the world. And so,
Yeah.
to the credit of the staff of the prosecutor, I think they have realized that the Philippines case is not a case where you require a lot of resources to carry out an investigation. What you will require in the Philippines case is a lot of resources to protect witnesses, to protect the families of witnesses, and to find ways to allow whistleblowers to come forward without doing them harm. And that's one of the most difficult parts of this work. That's not often reported on, that's not often visible, but that's crucial for this case to move forward. So it will take several years. Even if a warrant is issued, it will take years to get that warrant enforced. And then number two, it will take a lot of resources for this investigation to move forward to trial.
Now, the time frame is very important because politics is the issue here, right? So if you're Marcos Jr., um, caught between a rock and a hard place, right? Meaning, on one hand, you still want to continue your charm offensive with the West, which so far worked because of the exigencies of the new Cold War, the whole EDCA issue, etc.
Mhm.
Junior as a whiff of breath of fresh air, whatever, So you don't want to alienate your newfound friends or refound friends, and at the same time, you don't want to alienate the Dutertes, right? So the most sensible course of action would be kick the can down the road. I-dribble mo lang yan hanggang abot na yan sa next admin, and if it's a Sara Duterte, bahala na kayo dyan, di ba? Or if it's opposition, but that's my sense. Given Marcos Jr.'s temperament and the algorithm of his political strategy, he just wants to kick this can down the road as much as possible. So, do you think that's a feasible option? Probably some of them are listening to us like, Attorney Karen, do you think that's a strategy that could work? Let's just kick the can down the road, patagalin, i-dribble, throw mods here,
Well,
and then push it beyond 2028.
I understand the logic behind that if you were Marcos Jr., but you would also not want to kick the can so far that you can't bring it back if you needed it, right? So,
Right.
and does he need it? Does he need it soon? Is there an election coming up where his agenda and that of other families in the Philippines might not necessarily be the same? Of course, the ICC case is only one of the weapons that either any of these sides in Philippine politics can use.
Yeah, it's a whip. It's a whip. Yeah.
Going back to the Kenya example to illustrate, you had two people who were on different sides, but when they were both accused at the ICC, they ended up on the same side.
Unahan
So,
release.
these dynamics can affect these relationships domestically.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have the geopolitical dynamics that you have laid out very precisely, Richard, where you have China and the US and this so-called Cold War between them. But then again, you also have the possibility that China and the US will find a way out of this war, of their own Cold War, and learn to live with each other. And what happens to the little figures underneath them who thought that they were siding with one or the other? They'll be left behind to deal with the fallout of reconciliation between big powers. I think, and this is not advice to Marcos Jr., because in many ways, Marcos Jr.'s primordial interest is beyond any kind of legal advice. This is a country that is in the unfortunate situation of having to choose between a plunderer and a murderer.
I didn't know they're
and
mutual
so-
exclusive. We have had cases where the two.
Well, that's right. So I think that Marcos Jr. may want to consider the fact that he can return the money that their family stole, but Rodrigo Duterte cannot return the lives he took. And so, where would you fall in that situation?
Yeah, that's a big difference from that perspective, no? Yun nga, kasi you mentioned the case of Libya and then of course the Ukraine issue. The Ukraine we understand. It's a Europe issue, and Europe, ICC being in Europe, I understand why Karim Khan is trying to be the man of the hour. But isn't the Philippine case exceptional also in the sense that you're talking about tens of thousands? I mean, I'm not sure the case was as bad in Colombia. Was it tens of thousands also with the FARC? I don't think so. Was it? I don't know. Because my sense is the Philippine case was also very internationally covered, right? Yes, it's not in the same category as Libya or Ukraine, but it's not just one of the. I mean, no offense to Kenya. I mean, I know the election in Kenya was really violent back in the day, but the thing with Duterte is that he was in the news cycle for 6 years and now he's back again in the news cycle. So I'm just wondering about the politics of prioritization, if I can put it that way. Yeah.
Well, there's two considerations here. The prosecutor can pick cases, right? The prosecutor can
True.
pick cases, and there's a reason why a prosecutor anywhere, not just in the ICC, even
right.
prosecutor in Quezon City picks cases. You want to win your cases. You don't want to pick cases because they're there. Especially for the ICC in this case,
Right.
because the ICC is it's not a regular court that anyone can just go and file a case and a prosecutor is obliged to do something about it.
Right.
There are steps before he can even go forward. So when Fatou Bensouda, the predecessor of Karim Khan, decided that she would examine the Philippines case and therefore ask for authority to investigate, it was in large part prompted by the fact that it's a winnable case, that it's a case that a prosecutor at the ICC can win. And I think a good prosecutor will understand why it is winnable. it is winnable because, among other reasons, you have a defendant who cannot help but incriminate himself.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
so even that alone is a factor, and it's not a joke.
Yeah.
It is a situation where this defendant incriminates himself constantly. It's also a situation where you have evidence that has been laid out for you by media coverage. This does not require
Right.
secretly interviewing witnesses, although you do have whistleblowers that the ICC has already reached out to. So you have several factors that allow you to win this case. Um, and I think that's an important consideration here in deciding for the ICC to decide whether it should proceed or not. And that, I think, has created its own momentum for the ICC here. That's why it has proceeded, because there is no
Right.
reason not to proceed with the investigation.
Mm.
Um, Again, resources will be an issue. Uh, the ICC has a policy paper, and I think this is important to
Mm-hmm.
consider. In 2021, the prosecutor issued a policy paper in which it suggested that one strategy it might follow in prosecution is to target middle level perpetrators, meaning those who pull the trigger,
Right.
those who might have been part of a death squad.
So it could
The
be some sort of
strategy
Quezon City
argues
police head or something like that, right? Yeah.
exactly a present level person.
Mm.
The strategy argues that if you prosecute them first, you could turn them into
Whistleblowers.
witnesses. You could
Witnesses,
turn
yeah.
them into someone who will
Whistleblowers,
cooperate
yeah.
to implicate higher officials. That hasn't been very successful when it comes to war crimes and crimes against war crimes, particularly. In many ways, because the war crimes cases have involved paramilitary groups that do not necessarily follow a very clear hierarchy. So
Yeah.
it's hard to say
Chain of
who
command,
is the
yeah.
subordinate of whom.
Yeah.
But we are talking here of policemen doubling as death squad. So this is a situation where that strategy might in fact work. Target the middle level officials and then stage a second set of prosecutions for higher level people. So that suggests a possibility where warrants might issue
Right.
for middle level officials
First.
in the Philippines and not necessarily the highest officials at this point.
So if we were, again, I know in the legal profession people are not fond of making predictions, but if we were to make a kind of a prognostication about what's going to come next, is we can expect at least during the Marcos Jr. era, should he last the whole 6 years term, there will be potentially warrants of arrest against lower level officials under the previous administration. No, now there will be some whiff of movement, right? I mean, I think that's more high probability, no, more than 50% chance. Yan ang mangyari, diba? Yeah.
Yes.
I think this is important for people to hear, because I think there are some people who have, I would say, over expectations, and that there are some people who are completely dismissive about it. My sense is the reality will be somewhere in the middle, meaning some mid-level people will be facing some warrants of arrest. But knowing how we Filipinos are, no, and how this could explode, no, I think just the first warrant of arrest, no matter how low level the person could be, could create a huge kind of media coverage and political reaction. Which brings us back to Marcos Jr. I want to end our conversation on this. I mean, the more we talk, the more or less, let's just do a different episodes on A, B, and C, because ayoko ubusin in one, no? I usually used to do the Joe Rogan style, 3 to 4 hours. And then I realized, parang ayaw na bumalik yung guests ko kasi parang they feel assaulted.
Because it could be exhausting.
Yeah, like parang na-juice out ko yung guest ko. So now I said, no, I'll keep it 1 hour and I'll have them back again later on. Keep it fresh, right? So maybe I'll do the Joe Rogan style with some other people na iba yung lifestyle. Now going back to this, what is your read of the first year of Marcos Jr.? Because I would say politically, it's a detox for me, right? It's not 10, but it's from -5 to 0. I would say, like in the sense that, my goodness, I mean, Ruben, you should know, and for people who work in journalism, public intellectuals, I mean, it was really difficult, and I feel at least you don't have a situation whereby the president is talking about genitalia, genitalias, problems with their erectile issues of some of the journalists question him, like. Um, And Marcos Jr. doesn't have much of trolls. I mean, the bloggers turned against him once he purged some of the people who were handling the trolls. So, parang minsan ako pa yung parang fair sa kanya on foreign policy and then inattack siya ng mga DDS people and all. So, for me, it is a detox. But I have absolutely no illusion about the human rights situation. Although The Economist had an interesting piece a few months ago that said, well, it's not good, but at least there's a recalibration towards less killing and a little bit more of due process or something like that. But there's also the case of Leila de Lima, right? Maria Ress and Leila de Lima. Where do you see those cases going? Again, our assumption, of course, here is we are not living in a country with the rule of law, unfortunately. So clearly, political dynamics is a paramount consideration here. What
Right.
is? I know this is hard to call, but is the recent acquittals a good indication, or potentially it could be actually the opposite of the high point before the difficult things happening? Because I'm hearing very different things from people that I trust, that I know they have insider information on this.
Mhm. Well, I think, of course, the situation in the Philippines is that if you were to start with the lowest possible bar, anybody who rises even half an inch above that is an improvement, right? And so
Yeah.
when you start with, if you were to start Duterte and say, look, this is a person who presided over the killings of tens of thousands of poor Filipinos, a president who succeeds him, no matter who that is, who doesn't come out and say, let's kill more people, is better. And so if we use that Duterte standard, then we don't really go anywhere because it was so low as far as taking lives literally is concerned, that anybody who does not call for murder is better.
But Ruben,
But we
can I
are
push back
also.
against that? Sorry, for the sake of argument.
Mhm.
I know very well, I know many people who had PTSDs after Marco Jr. won, and they were expecting within the first 6 months, we're going to see essentially the completion of the project started either by Duterte or the Marcos Sr. I mean, the idea was Marcos Jr. having 60%, 31 million votes, officially at least, right? He's gonna go for it. He's gonna go all the way into the China embrace. He's gonna go for all sorts of mumbo jumbos. Essentially, he's gonna recreate a dictatorship. Obviously, I was not a believer of that. Immediately, my first article the next day was, "Don't panic," right? Because Marcos Jr. has a different ball game. But I know many people who are not expecting -5 to 0, right? But we're expecting -5 to -4, or maybe even pushing the -5 to -8, if I can put it very crudely, right? So I completely agree with you, right? Like, we shouldn't take 0. Pain relief is not a good thing. It's just a relief from pain. But I'm just trying to be fair in a sense that I know by heart there were many people that were absolutely panicking once Marcos Jr. won with such a huge margin, and it's Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte totally decimated oppositions. Risa lang nandun sa Senate. Parang there was a sense of panic.
Mhm.
Ruben, no, I just want to be fair about this.
Well,
So, so I hope you
yeah,
appreciate
I
where I come from when you
understand.
say detox, kasi yun yung PTSD fear ng iba. Oo.
No, I understand that, but I think it also, that fear and the fact that it didn't come true comes from the premise that Marcos Jr. has an agenda beyond the most important one, which is to make sure that his family uh, is able to revise how his father's dictatorship is seen, and that his family gets to keep what they stole. Everything
So
else
total
that he has
rehabilitation.
been,
Total
yeah,
rehabilitation. Full spectrum.
everything else
Yeah.
that he has been doing um, tries to serve those two goals. Uh, you don't have to kill people to serve those two goals. You may have to steal more money in order to keep the money you already stole, because you want people around you to have something to stuff their pockets with. So you might want to create an investment fund so that they can dip their hands into the investment fund while
You mean debt? You
your
mean
loot
debt
is
fund?
safe.
Kasi wala tayong wealth, so debt
Right.
fund.
Yes. You might want to try to please the United States
Right.
on one hand, incidentally, because it makes you look like you're a modernizing person that's different from Duterte, but that's not really your goal. Your goal is to be able to go literally to the United States, get rid of the cases that your sons and Imelda Marcos's grandsons will have to face. This is a civil case against their fortune. This is not a criminal
Can you
case
talk about
against
that,
them.
Ruben?
So
And what are the cases in the U.S.? Sorry again for cutting you, because I think that's absolutely important.
Right.
There are many people. I mean, I come from the north, right? My middle name is Foronda, right? So there are people who believe that there are no cases. Those are just fake news. Tapos na settled na cases. We know that their contempt cases were not showing up in the courts, right? Millions of dollars. Can you give a refresher? There
Sure.
are pending cases in U.S.
There
courts
is.
right now, right? Yeah. Still, yeah.
They're not even just pending. They have been decided. There's a $2 billion judgment.
Oh, there's a
against the
judgment. It's
Marcos
fine. So
family.
you just have to appeal it, right? Yeah.
It's $2 billion damages.
Just
And
just
this
20,
is
just
this is
2 billion. Just what's that, right?
and this is a judgment that can be renewed every couple of years, and it's been renewed twice, and it has been renewed now past the Marcos presidency. So 2031
Oh,
renewed. The judgment can be enforced against the Marcoses past the Marcos presidency, past the temporary immunity that he has.
as a
He's not
sovereign.